Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. I'd like to open by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands across New South Wales on which we are meeting today, and show my respect to elders past and present. Today we are being joined by Peter Shergold, and we'll be hearing about policy failure, hopefully how to avoid it and how to learn from it. Peter Shergold is the third generation of his family to work in the public sector. In 1912, his granddad became a bus driver and for the next 50 years was an employee of Brighton Council in the UK. And was recruited to join the Australian Public Service, where he stayed for the next 2 decades, spending his last 5 years as Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Since 2008, he has chaired a range of private, public and not-for-profit boards and is now Chancellor of Western Sydney University. He has served on committees of the Commonwealth, Western Australia, New South Wales, Queensland governments in the areas of education, aged care and public service renewal. He has written on major project failures, the community sector, refugee settlement, Medicare security, building regulation and most recently senior secondary pathways. He chairs the New South Wales Education Standards Authority and is part-time New South Wales Coordinator General of Settlement. He is still learning from his mistakes and just what it takes to be a policy professional. So today's webinar will be an interview style for the first 30 minutes and we'll open then to questions from the audience. If you have a question for Peter, pop it in the chat with everyone and I'll choose some of those to put to Peter. We'll be finishing up at around 9:45. So let's get started. Peter, what does this word policy mean to you?
Well, pardon, let me start a bit boldly. Policy, and of course talking about public policy. Public policy at its heart seems to me based on an unwritten contract between the state and its citizens. You know, the state agrees to provide security to citizens in return for them putting their individual interests as second to the community interests. It's unwritten, but that's what our system of democratic governance, at least, is based upon. So from my point of view, if you start from there, public policy and the role of public servants is about the way governments implement their political decisions, how they do provide that safety and protection in multifarious different ways, how they deliver services to support citizens, how they collect revenues from citizens to fund those services, how they try and regulate public conduct in pro-social ways, how they seek to redistribute wealth and income and so on. Always, in other words, where the policy is trying to place the collective interests, the public interests first and foremost. So for me, and this is why it's so exciting and so tricky, policy is that cutting edge between the rights and the responsibilities, the entitlements and the obligations of citizens. And that's why I subscribe very strongly to strategies to improve, the service that public servants provided. But I am uneasy, have been uneasy since the heyday of customer service charters 25 years ago. I am uneasy about talking about the public we serve through our policy as customers. You see, it seems to me that a customer in the private sector, the client, the consumer, the customer, is very different from our role with citizens. If you think about it, a customer has enormous choices. Citizens actually don't. The people we design policy for don't have a choice. Oh, that sounds a pretty good policy. I'll go along with that one, but I don't like that one, so I won't. I'll buy that one, but not that one. I quite like that regulation, but I don't like that regulation. A citizen is different. A citizen has rights and responsibilities, quite different from a customer. Also, although I embrace and think New South Wales has done a great job in improving service quality, I myself think public policy is about citizens and not customers. And that's, I think, a pretty profound distinction, and what should be at the heart of what we do. Sorry, did that not come through?
No, it came through. I just couldn't find my unmute button.
For a moment.
Thanks, Peter. So that does really give us a sense of what policy is all about, and focusing on citizens and that broader public perspective. I'm just going to reflect back, and for those of us who have been along the journey of this webinar program with us, you might remember the very first webinar that we did was on established frameworks and theories for understanding policy, from the policy cycle to incrementalism, garbage can, multiple streams, and the advocacy coalition framework. Peter, do you have a preferred theoretical or even practical framework that has helped you develop your understanding of policy?
Well, the answer is no. So there you go. And I know this sounds, a rather old-fashioned view, but I do find, most of the theories, even the frameworks I've read, some of which are quite useful, a bit highfalutin for what we actually do. And I remembered of an academic article right back in the 1950s, which said one of the things that public servants do is to master the art and craft of muddling through. And there is, in my view, a part of that in what we do. And what I mean by that is my, 30 plus years of experience in public policy, and I suspect it's not different from most of yours, is that public policy is a highly iterative process. And every time we're involved in policy, it moves in slightly different ways. It evolves in response to changing external circumstances. It changes because of politics and the environment of political contest in which public policy is made. It changes because as we develop policies, we always know there are going to be winners and losers, or if not winners and losers, there are going to be big winners and little winners, or big losers and little losers. So you're constantly having to battle to put this together. Now, I could be wrong, but I cannot think offhand in 3 decades of any significant policy in which I have been involved where the final outcome bore great resemblance to the first idea of what that policy was going to be. And that's why public servants, let me say, are important. Skilled public servants, they are different from outside consultants, because the advantages of a public servant is you are positioned at that point of situational authority where you are at the center of all these necessary compromises and changes that have got made. So that seems to me at the very, very heart of public policy. Now, there are certain attributes that I think are important. Of course, I believe in the importance of evidence and evidence-based policy. I'd have to say most of the time in the public service, I've seen much more policy-based evidence than evidence-based policy. I've seen many times when I have been out, looking for evidence which was going to, in effect, support the decision that the government had already made. That, of course, is not what I mean. One of the frustrations to me, though, is that too many people who talk about evidence-based policy undermine the value of experience-based policy. So for me, in making policy, in my theory, evidence is important, but so is experience. And therefore, one of the things that most frustrates me about policy making is how, in fact, public servants often take too little advantage of the cutting edge, frontline experience that others outside the public sector have. We talk about, public-private partnerships for building infrastructure. And of course, to a very large extent, both in New South Wales and in other jurisdictions, human services are delivered predominantly by not-for-profit community organisations. But you know what? We still tend to think of the private sector or the community sector as deliverers of policy. Now, what madness is this? Because very often they are deliverers because we believe they've had experience. So why not bring that experience in at the start? Why not make use? Why don't public servants become these skilled facilitators that are actually able to bring the experience of other sectors into the making of public policy? So that to me is absolutely crucial. And of course, I do believe very strongly that whatever we do in the public service, this is a very unusual vocation, which many outside don't understand, by which I mean that we have to work in public policy where we understand that our role is to serve successive governments with equal commitment, to be, if you like, non-partisan, not non-political. I can't imagine being a good public servant if you are non-political, if you don't understand the political context in which public policy has to be delivered. But it does mean to me that public servants' role is to listen to the goals being set by the government of the day, and then working with that to try and help them to think, well, how could they deliver on those goals in the most important way? So, it's not a theory, but if I don't have a theory and I have these few ideas, I do have one abiding principle. So this, if you like, is the Shergold principle of public policy, and that is you can only judge the quality of a public policy by the manner in which it is actually delivered. I can remember once a very esteemed colleague telling me when a policy was going wrong that it was a really elegant policy on paper. And I thought, how sad is that? You can't have an elegant policy on paper if you can't deliver that elegance in a way that the public can actually see. The home insulation program, talking about learning from home insulation program may have been a pretty good idea of helping to get us out the GFC while creating a beneficial environmental impact. Maybe robo-debts was quite a clever way of thinking how we could bring Centrelink and tax data together to find out those who had been overpaid. Maybe introducing fee help for vocational education students. Maybe, I think hotel quarantine was a really good means of protecting us from the predations of COVID-19. Every one of those was a public policy disaster because of our failure to implement them successfully and to manage the risks effectively. The policy was undermined. My view is if what happens then is public trust in government and in public service is undermined. So my principle is the development of policy, the delivery of policy have to be absolutely intertwined. We've got to stop thinking that people who are really smart and agile and creative and innovative, they can go and design the policy. And then there is these sort of, these boring batshits who really want to specialize in project management and risk management. No, actually, the project managers and the risk managers are a key part, or should be a key part, of the development of policy. So that's my one and only real theory of public policy.
I think that's terrific advice for us all, and implementation is such a big part of the process, but it's often not the bit that gets the initial attention. And
on that, I do think that in general, not always, but in general, I think that from my experience, state public services tend to focus much more of their efforts on policy delivery than at the Commonwealth. And I think actually the Commonwealth can often learn quite a lot from the experience of states. My view on home insulation policy, for example, is the Commonwealth could have learned much more from the experience of the states in working with the building sector.
Yes. Now, policy failure is something that the public service is often uncomfortable talking about. And I wanted to ask you why we should focus more on policy failure and how we can create the opportunities for reflection.
Well, if you only learn from success, I suspect most of us are going to have only a very small number of cases we can call on. I mean, we have successes and we have partial successes. Even in the partial successes, though, there are elements of failure. My view, of course, learn from success, but my own view is making mistakes. Learning from mistakes is probably a much better teacher. And we do have to accept that we will make mistakes, and we learn from that. I have to say, I think the Premier Gladys Berejiklian last week did a very good job of talking about, the failures of Ruby Princess and what went wrong, and arguing, no, she wasn't going to respond that, these number of public servants had been sacked as a result of it. She made the point, yes, you make mistakes, and many of those mistakes are human. They are human errors, and you learn from them. And you do really try and learn from. Now, the trouble is, every management course you go through for the last 10 years, someone will tell you it's important to learn from mistakes. This is, and we encourage you to learn from mistakes. And I have to say, in my view, there's a significant element of bullshit in all of that. And what I think about learning from failure involves is learning personally from failure. What I mean by that is when I've done seminars on learning from failure, for the first 10 or 15 minutes, and I get people to reflect on public policy failures in which they've had a role, they will often reflect quite thoughtfully on how the systems were wrong, or how the structures were unresponsive, or perhaps how their colleagues or their leaders or their consultants or their providers were either, incompetent or ineffective, or that there were these unexpected circumstances which emerged, all of which are probably true, but they are not the heart of the truth if we want to learn from failure. The heart of the truth is saying, and I contributed to that failure when I think about it in these ways. I wasn't able to persuade my boss. I didn't do a good enough job of articulating the reasons. I didn't foresee the circumstances that might emerge. I, not alone, but I was part of the failure. That's what I think learning from failure actually involves. But what we then need to do, and this is, I think, the more exciting part, is start to think how we can incorporate the possibility of failure in public policy. And what I mean by that is, let's be willing to be experimental, even though we know experiment carries risks. So let's, for example, roll out a new public policy, perhaps in different ways, in different places, and see how it actually works. Let's be willing not to spend 18 months going through IDCs, but to actually take a decision, see how it works, start it on a small scale. If it's not effective, then fail, and fail quickly. Just stop it after 6 months. I know that didn't work. Or think of how to adapt and evaluate as you go. And then, and only then, you think, well, this is working in this adapted way. Now let's start to scale it up and roll it out at a state level or a national level. Now, don't you think it's pretty bizarre? I mean, this is so bleeding obvious, and yet governments rarely do this. You know, think of robo-debt. Robo-debt would have been an easy thing to say, this is a really good idea. So why don't we try it on a small scale in 2 or 3 different ways, in 2 or 3 different areas, with a small number of people, and actually evaluate that over the 3 months and find out what are the problems. And then we'll make a decision whether to roll it out. We could have avoided so much, but we don't do it. So if we incorporate the notion that failure is a part of the design of creativity, if we do that, then I think we can start to be genuinely more agile and adaptive, and all those words we like to use.
That sounds like a terrific, like you're throwing down the gauntlet to us to be a lot more innovative in the way that we think about policy development. And, you know, we do have the opportunity through regional approaches or across Australia with all the different states and territories that we have to try that and learn from each other's mistakes as well as our own. So I just wanted to go back. You did mention success then, and my experience is that when talking about policy success and going to other people's webinars and courses, that everyone has an opinion on the special ingredients needed for policy success. How do you define policy success, and what are the top 5 factors that you think is important?
That's a really, really good question. And immediately you get involved in any public policy, I think your first task should be, well, what is the purpose of this policy, and what would success look like? It sounds obvious, but often you can get caught up in designing policy. You probably started with those ideas, but as you get into the detail of the policy, you tend to forget those basic ingredients. So for me, it is, you know, I'm presently working on a number of educational policies. I just chaired that report on senior secondary pathways. And with David Gonski, I'm doing some work for the Premier on vocational education in New South Wales. Now, obviously, in looking at senior secondary pathways, I think the first thing is to make sure, well, let's identify, before I start to get into the detail, what is the outcome that we would like of young people when they leave school at 18. Let's start from that. What is it we would like? And then from that, you drive back, well, does the present system actually deliver that? And if not, then how can we improve it? And then, and only then, do I start to get into the issues about the distortionary effects of 8R on schools, etc. So the first thing I think is to make sure you can identify what is the purpose of policy. And I can tell you, I spent 5 years in PM&C, seeing every cabinet submission that came forward. And, you know, I can remember reading some cabinet submissions, really good public policy. And at the end, I put them down and I actually did think, what is the problem that this policy is trying to solve? So that should be the start. And then going hand in hand with that is how can that public policy be conveyed publicly? So my starting and finishing position is this. I need to know what is the purpose, what I'm trying to address, what the outcomes are going to be. Then I'll get into the detail. But then I've got to come back out of that detail and to be able to create a persuasive story, a narrative that the public can understand about what is the purpose of the policy. So identifying purpose is key, and then being able to tell that story. And then, of course, to allow experience and evidence and the involvement of recipients of that policy to be built in. Of course, I believe, you know, in human-centered design. You know, increasingly, I think we've got to be serious about trying to incorporate the experience of those who are going to be subject to the policy to influence, so that I talk to really wonderful experts, knew far more about senior secondary education than I did in working on that report. And I was very influenced by what they said. But honestly, can I say truthfully, what changed my mind on many issues is having structured conversations over 3 hours in many areas with groups of year 10, 11, 12 students and getting their perspective. And that has influenced then the policy proposals that came forward. So I think all of that is, to me, you know, goes to the heart of what is success. I suppose the other thing I would add is resilient. I actually like the Victorian word doggedness. You know, it's dogged as does it. I think public servants need resilience, not just because they'll have failures and mistakes, but so often they'll have really good ideas and they don't go forward, or they don't get taken up, or you've worked on something for a bloody year and then it doesn't see the light of day. All of that, you know, it takes a particular type of internal fortitude, I think, to actually say no, and that is part of my job. That is going, you know, I'm going to have wins and losses and etc. But it is that resilience, I think, that you need. And of course, people will say, well, yes, everybody does. You know, I've worked with many really fine public servants who've become older, more senior public servants. And when I talk with them, there is that sort of, in some cases, almost an element of learned, professional, unruffled skepticism. You know, that they've developed, if you like, a thick skin. And of course, that's one of the ways you protect yourself against, you know, so often that what you're working on doesn't come about in the way. And I think they find the way I talk, the sort of passion I bring, a bit off-putting, you know. And I think, well, I can't do much about that. But for me, it's about somehow having the resilience to retain the enthusiasm for what you can do as a public servant, and the excitement and the importance around public policy that you've got to keep, I think, holding dear. And probably when you've lost that, people lose it at different stages, it's time to say, well, it's time to call it a day.
I love that. One of my favourite quotes is, nothing great was ever done without enthusiasm. So something I hold true to my heart. Now, I want to ask a question. It's come up before from our audience, not on this webinar, but in previous times, where they experience a situation where difficult policy issues, important issues, seem not to get traction in decision-making forums. Has this happened to you? What did you do? What advice would you give to policy teams that are in this situation?
Sorry, so repeat that again. So you're working on something.
Yeah, a really important issue or difficult issue, and it seems not to get traction in decision-making forums, by ministers or, senior leaders within the public service or cabinet. Has this happened to you? And what did you do about it?
Well, yes. So this is tricky because I'm going to talk about what I think as a public servant is one of my greatest successes that actually then turned out to be one of my most abject failures, but it does illustrate the point well. So obviously I was a secretary in a number of departments and then head of PM&C during the years of the Howard government. And I can remember 2 or 3 occasions since the start of that government where there were attempts to persuade the government to be more willing to have a public policy to respond to climate change, either a carbon tax.
Sorry, keep going. I think someone's obviously joined us from a busy road.
Oh, yeah. I love those. So it would have been very easy, to be frank, to give up. And yet, in the final 2 years of the Howard government, Ken Henry and Martin Parkinson, a few others, and myself, because of, I think, we discerned that in spite of our past failures, there was nevertheless a change in the external environment, driven in part by a substantive drought in Australia, that there seemed to be a mood for change. And what we were picking up in industry is industry was starting to say, look, we need a decision, because at the moment there is so much uncertainty that people are not investing in energy or energy using manufacturing in Australia. So we decided once again to have a crack at trying to persuade the government to reconsider its position on an emissions trading scheme. There had been at least one clear failure at Cabinet about 3-4 years before. The government said, we're not going to have anything to do with that. So we went back and argued the case. The Prime Minister decided, well, I'm not convinced, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to give you a really, really difficult group to work with. And if you come back to me out of this emissions trading task group with arguments about why we should move to an ETS as part of a global solution, then I'll be willing to listen. Most of the media at the time thought this was simply procrastination. It was a means of the Prime Minister kicking the can down the dusty street beyond the next election. So, I had an emissions trading group which had representatives of the airlines, the aluminium industry, the mining industry, the coal industry, all on this panel. Not the sort of people you would think are going to subscribe to an emissions trading scheme. But actually, on the basis of evidence, they were persuaded that it was worth it. And it was probably best, I suspect from their point of view, to get an emissions trading scheme designed with a Conservative government, which would have flexibilities within it than maybe a Labour government coming in and introducing, a more rigid ETS. I don't know, but I'm guessing that. And then I realised that if I was going to bring this off, it was no use using the sort of language that might have appealed to a Labour Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd later, the greatest moral challenge of the 21st century. That wasn't the language which was going to cut through. My language, therefore, to get this up was to say, look, I don't want to argue about the climate science. I know you've got some deep skeptics, but I think what all you need to know is there is sufficient evidence that there is a major risk from the future. And that's what governments do. Governments manage future risks. So in my view, you need to manage that risk. Now, let's not have a fight about how good the science is or what all these projections say. There is a risk. Let's manage that risk. And let's think what the most efficient way of managing that risk is, which in our view, is using a market system. And therefore, against the odds, genuinely against the odds, 4 months before the election, people will probably have forgotten that the John Howard government committed to an emissions trading scheme to be introduced in 2011 or 2012. We would have had it. Now, of course, it turned into my most abject failure, because then with the change of government and the way politics is, we're here sitting here in 2020 and we still don't have that. But it's a good example, I think, of you can keep coming back. Circumstances change, arguments change. You can keep going and hope to achieve change. Don't give up. Happy to take any other questions from people.
I am going to turn to the audience for questions now, given the time, because we have about 10 minutes or so left. So I think one of the themes, so if anyone wants to put on a question, just pop it in the chat with everyone, and I'll try and pick up some of the more kind of general themes, I think, given the time that we've got. One of the questions or aspects that seems to kind of have been is taking off is this idea of trialling things and experimenting or being willing to fail. But how do we as public servants sell that message to a government that's quite focused on communicating their policy achievements to the electorate?
Well, I don't think you go to a minister and say, look, I've got a great idea. It might fail, but let's give it a go. So I think my view is you persuade, well, frankly, you persuade your colleagues, first of all, and then persuade ministers where you see opportunities to be willing to go and trial something. I think this notion of the idea of pilots and demonstrations needs to be revived. Unfortunately, when you hear often about demonstration projects, what it really meant was that you wanted to roll out something across the state, but it didn't get up through expenditure review committee. They gave you a bit of money to do it on a small scale, so you called it a demonstration project. I'm talking about a demonstration project which is designed to see if something works. And we can connect that with, I think, what is a growing interest in, place-based, community-based approaches. So I wouldn't start with failure. I'd say well, let me again give you an example. When Barry O'Farrell came in, I was still CEO of the Centre for Social Impact. And I had been very attracted by some innovations going on overseas, particularly in the UK, in terms of getting government involved in social impact investment, working with social enterprises, bringing in private and community sector support in not just the delivery, but into the funding of public policy. We called them social impact bonds and the social benefit bonds. Now, I didn't say to the Premier, I've got this quite radical, bold idea. I think you'd like it. It's innovative, but let's go for it and roll out a network of social benefit bonds. I said, Premier, what I'd like us to do, if we can, is to issue 2 or 3 bonds, and we will do it in areas where you are able to say, hand on heart, there have been generations of policy failures things like, well, the areas we started on was the area of children having to be removed from dysfunctional families. And, you know, there'd been successive policies. And so I was able to say to him, Premier, let's try it on a small scale. We'll try 2 or 3. I think it's going to work. If it works, we will do more, which is now what we've done. But if not, we will draw a line underneath it. And if you are asked, and this is in fact what the Premier did, he was able to say, look, I don't know if these are going to work, but I think it's an idea worth trying. And frankly, this is an area where there have been successive public policy failures. It's clear to me that government don't have all the answers. So let's trial this and see if some of these community organisations do have the answers. So it's a way of letting him do it on a small scale and managing failure. You've got to say, we can manage risks because we can trial this. Let's use some of the behavioural psychology and the behavioural insights we now have and do it in different ways, and only then roll out in a sense that allows you to be innovative, but without all the disasters if you fail on a large scale.
I think there will be some people thinking about how to embed that in their own arguments today. I think we have time probably for one last question, and I wanted to go back to a question that we received earlier in the chat about building the narrative in when public trust is lacking, or in a post-truth world. And how we as public servants help our ministers and all the citizens who we are really working for to grapple with some of the difficult issues when there is that also drive towards an undermining of our institutions, even our institutions of truth.
That is such it's a great and a profound question, and you can only skirt across the edge of it. I mean, because I do think my starting position is to all of you who are online today, that you have a significantly tougher role as public servants than I did when I joined the public service over 30 years ago. And that's because I think levels of trust in democratic governance have declined significantly. And the role of public servants is more misunderstood. We have moved to a political system that's more fragmented and tribalized. And therefore, the role of a public servant who serves successive governments is often much harder for people in the public to understand. I think we do have a key role as public servants, both helping governments to create the narrative and ourselves creating the narrative about why a strong public sector is actually important. And to be honest with you, there are parts of this crisis that we can seize. Don't let a crisis go to pass. I've talked about what I think is failures in public administration at this crisis, and the failures are represented by Ruby Princess and Melbourne hotel quarantine. They are the failures to be able to deliver up to the expectations, probably of governments, but certainly to the expectations of the public, because we didn't manage it. And that undermines faith. But I've got to say, hand in hand with that, I have been quite stimulated by the fact that faith in public service expertise has been reinvigorated by crisis. No Premier or Prime Minister will now appear to talk about this without a public health expert by their side. And we've seen it, I think, in New South Wales during the bushfire crisis as well. You know, it was public experts who were brought to the fore. And I thought that was great because it helps to restore faith in expertise at a time when conspiratorialism is greater, being driven by social media, and it helps to restore faith in public service. The more we can do this, to be seen as having an expertise which is delivered in the public interest, the better it is. And to be honest with you, I suspect most Australians, you know, whatever their views may have been on the ins and outs of Medicare, most Australians would now think, gee, you know, we have done overall, with all the mistakes we've made, we have done pretty well in Australia because of the strength of the fact that we've got a real public health system, you know, compared with, for example, the United States. So I think there are parts of this crisis which we can build on to, if you like, restore and reinvigorate that faith. And we should do this bearing in mind, and I'll say this to you and probably not to the ministers you all serve, that in spite of the fact that trust in public servants is not high, all the polling I have seen out of Roy Morgan polling on occupations, I think, as I remember, trust in federal and state politicians is running at about 16%, 1/6 that is. I think faith in public servants is running at about 36%. So it is worth reminding ourselves that there is, you know, still more trust and confidence in the role of public servants than there is in government. And we can use that, I hope, to help to restore faith in democratic governance, especially amongst the young, for whom commitment to democratic values, I think, is significantly weaker. Sorry, I can't hear you.
I think I'm on now. Thank you very much. I've just seen the time, and we, unfortunately, that's been a fantastic session for us, very gripping, and we've covered a lot of ground. So I wanted to thank you, Peter, very much for your time today, and our audience as well for listening in. I also wanted to thank Indy and Belinda behind the scenes who helped us set this up. And we have still quite a big program of webinars through to the end of the year, and we'll be getting more communication on that shortly, including on the health challenges with coronavirus and evidence-based policy, or maybe it's policy-based evidence. We'll have to check with them. All right, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you. I get reinvigorated by being able to deal with communities like yours. So well done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you.